is Block 8. Pax Americana, Section 2, the Cold War begins with the section entitled the United Nations. The United Nations is the successor to the failed League of Nations. The League of Nations, as you remember, obviously failed to stop World War II, and the League of Nations also did not have the United States or the Soviet Union as participatory members. The United Nations, both the US and the USSR, joined very, very quickly. What made the United Nations fundamentally different from its predecessor was the fact that it was not simply a majority rule vote to have the United Nations move. That at the top of the United Nations was something called the Security Council. And the Security Council, this was all written in 1945, that in 1945 it took the victorious powers and said these 5 victorious powers are the most important countries on earth, and they will serve as the what was known as the Security Council, kind of the ultimate decider of the United Nations. And those 5 countries were the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain. Those are kind of the 3 obvious ones. France is given a seat on the Security Council because I guess French people jump up and down and make silly noises when they don't get their way. And China was given the 5th seat on the Security Council in recognition of its role in the fight against Japan. What made the Security Council unique was the fact that any one of those 5 countries could exercise a veto, and that veto was final. The United Nations could not act without all 5 of those countries working in concert. You can imagine that this presupposes cooperation. The entire United Nations presupposes that the United States and the Soviet Union are going to be able to work together, otherwise they would just constantly veto each other's things. And that's in fact what very often did end up happening. But at its conception, at its inception at least, the idea is that the victorious powers will be able to cooperate in the post-war world, and the United Nations is set up that way. The rest of the world's nations make up the General Assembly, which is important, but it is not of the same importance as the Security Council. Early on, the United Nations got involved with a lot of post-war crises. It helped preserve the peace in Iran. It played a role in the creation of the State of Israel. It guided former colonies to independence. That's something that we can touch on briefly here. This is not a world history class, it's a US history class. But throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, all of those enormous European colonial empires, all of them become independent. And the European nations, the imperial powers, don't have empires really by the end of the 1960s and 1970s for a few holdouts. The United Nations did a lot of good work with some of its committees. UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, organizes cross-cultural dialogue between countries. The FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, provides food and tries to make sure that people on Earth do not go hungry. The World Health Organization, the WHO, provides vaccines and basic hygiene to billions, really, millions and then billions of people around the world. That as much problems as the United Nations has had in the past and continues to have today, they have also done some good throughout the world as well.